Good evening. As we know, words are arbitrary and they owe their power to association, and they have the influence which customs has given them. For, as we know, and as Dr. Johnson said, language is the dress of thought. Therefore, on hearing the words democracy in America, some viewers will think of Alexis de Tocqueville's book with the same title. Others, not having read the book, which is no mean feat, will think that it took a Frenchman to appreciate American democracy as it existed nowhere else, at least at the time. Still others may think that the concept of democracy and America are indissolubly and maybe exclusively linked, just as America is the exceptional nation in the words of Obama. But as there is a history in all men's lives, so there is one in all men's words. And in this particular case, it may interest some to know the curious and fortuitous circumstances that caused the book to be written. First, an anecdote. Prior to the Normandy landing in 1944, American planes bombed the hinterland, and one of their targets was the family castle of the Tocquevilles, which was heavily damaged. But after the war, and to repair the castle, the Tocquevilles family sold all of the manuscripts of Alexis to the Yale University. And ironically, American pilots were given a little booklet containing extracts from Tocqueville's most famous book, possibly to read or use should they be shot down in enemy's territory. Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America in the 1830s, after an epic journey to America with his friends and colleagues Gustave de Beaumont. They originally intended to study the penitential system in the United States, but once they got there, they decided to conduct a thoroughly sociological study of the nation. For the record, France has just undergone, or if you like, survived the French Revolution, Napoleon's, we can call it French exceptionalism, the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, and the Revolution of 1830, featuring a change of dynasty and the crowning of a bourgeois king, Louis-Philippe d'Orléans. Anecdotally, Louis-Philippe was also a gourmet and had long lived in exile in London. When famous parliamentary at the time and later Prime Minister Disraeli paid an official visit to Paris, Louis-Philippe at dinner insisted on slicing the ham for Disraeli. And Disraeli said, I cannot allow this, a king to cut the ham for me. And Louis-Philippe said, no, I learned this, how to cut the world's thinnest slices of ham from the chef of a London restaurant that I patronized when I was in exile in London. And we can say that this evidence that was clearly a bourgeois king. But I digress. Louis-Philippe himself would eventually flee Paris in disguise at the beginning of the next 1848 revolution, bloody revolution, which was followed by a short-lived republic and eventually by the empire of Napoleon III. By the way, those interested in the turbulent post-Napoleonic period in France may watch the related video I produced, which is titled Revolutions Then and Now, which you can find on my website, the link to. Yet, only the most notorious revolutions have made it to history, we could say, or to history books. The post-1789 French Revolution period is full with more upheavals, reformers, and revolutionaries. Some of them are Babeuf, Saint-Simon, Proudhon, Fourier, and others. In this turbulent climate, credulity did for America the office of faith and, if you like, panegyric, the office of information. Or rather, America became a kind of a screen on which Europe would or could project its vision of an ideal world, accompanied by a sublime indifference to fact. And here is an example from a European journalist. In Virginia, the members chosen to establish a new government assembled in a peaceful wood, removed from the sight of the people, in an enclosure prepared by nature with banks of grass. And in this simple spot they deliberated on who should preside over them. And here is another one. The day when Washington resigned his command in the Hall of Congress, a crown inlaid with jewels had been placed on the books of the Constitution. Suddenly Washington seized the crown, broke it, and threw the pieces before the assembled people. How petty the historical Caesar seems before this hero of America. Now, in the imagination of enthusiastic Europeans, America had removed all artificial distinctions. The American, wrote a German professor, are the most fortunate people in the world. They do not even know the name of the many burdens worn by many subjects in Europe, and so forth. In the 1830s, a trip from Europe to America could take from 4 weeks to 3 months. And the travel of Tocqueville throughout America was extensive, at least for the time, reaching Vermont and New Hampshire in the north, Ohio and Michigan in the Midwest, followed by a round-trip tour to the south. The Tocqueville books are massive, but some anecdotes may give at least the flavor of his observations. For example, given the absence of any touring accommodation or facilities or system, the travelers had to resort to local pioneers and homesteaders to obtain night hospitality for man, guide, and horse. Hospitality that, as a rule, was given quite willingly. Tocqueville noticed that the host did not make any inquiries about the guests, or their origins, where they came from, or their reason for their travel. Questioned about why he had given hospitality to strangers, one host replied that he did so because he expected the reciprocity when he would find himself in the same situation. As for interest in the guest, the matter for him was irrelevant because all his efforts were dedicated to production and to establish and expand his farm and homestead. Therefore, he had no time. He had no time for anything else. Once in New England, Tocqueville reached a town while they were holding an election, and he documented the procedure and noted how properly and carefully the election was organized. As we recall or know, in the North had already abolished slavery, and blacks had the right to vote. Yet, none showed up at the polling station. At first, Tocqueville was told that the blacks would vote in the afternoon, but they did not show up. And on asking about this absence, the election staff replied half-jokingly that if any black would show up to vote, he would be whipped. In the South, Tocqueville discovered that those farmers whose permanent residence was in the North had actually two families, one in the North and one in the South. And the growing season for tobacco and cotton is relatively short, about 4 months. Therefore, these farmers divided their time and residence, if you like, accordingly. The travelers learned with horror that when the white part-time southern plantation owner died, his sons from family number 2 would be sold as slaves, because the owner's northern heirs considered their father's sons in the plantation as part of the inheritance, an investment to be sold for the best return. And though slaves generally lived in poor conditions, they were still significantly better off as slaves in the South than as free men in the North. Why? Because slaves were a saleable asset, and they were worth more alive in reasonable conditions, and therefore saleable, than dead and unsaleable. On returning to France, the travelers, Tocqueville and friend, decided to ride separately. His friend Beaumont wrote a sociological novel about the plight of the natives, where Tocqueville, in his extended 2 books, reached some tentative conclusions, which I will try here to summarize, however broadly. Problems in the US were in reality the same problems as in France and everywhere, but France could not copy or reproduce the American system. Theory is complex. Democracy is simultaneously the best and the worst political system, and accordingly, when citizens vote, they simultaneously accept the best and the worst. The popular view in France at the time was that America's legendary democratic superiority had to do with her laws, which Tocqueville studied and documented in great detail. But that was not true. Mexico, for example, translated and copied the American laws verbatim, but with very different effects. Mexico did not, as we know, at least at the time, become a democracy. Conclusion. The laws do not per se make a system democratic. Otherwise, it would only be necessary to translate the laws from the country where they have been proven to work to another, and the problem would be solved. Another theory held that democracy in America provided a safety valve for the dissatisfied who could renounce the comforts of civilization and seek freedom by moving to the western frontier. Still, the idea of creating a US-like frontiers in parts of Europe to resolve social problems was not convincing, even assuming that it had been possible. What and when is a system really democratic? Tocqueville asks himself in the book. Studying history reveals a reality that cannot be reversed or repressed. And the reality is that the constant historical progress towards equality, notably from the 13th century onward, however accompanied by persistent social inequality, this trend is undisputed, true. Money creates social inequality, but as we know, so do race and religion. Yet, beyond doubt, is the historical direction towards equality, accompanied by a generalized yearning for liberty. Liberté, fraternité, égalité, said the Jacobins, who nevertheless proved their fraternal spirit by generously using the guillotine, as we well know. Yet Tocqueville cannot answer what does liberty really consist of, because, he says, liberty is a sensation. When someone asked him to define it, Tocqueville replied that the very asking the question proved that the person who posed the question himself never felt free and therefore could not understand the idea. Years later, in a conference where he was asked the same question, Tocqueville said that freedom does not exist because it is a sentiment akin to love, as described, for example, by the famous French novelist Madame de Sévigné. And, much like love, it is crucial to perceive and feel the sensation of freedom every day and continuously, for if we do not feel the sensation, there is no freedom. Still, the mind is pleased to be delivered on any terms from perplexity and suspense, at least so says Tocqueville. But when the mass man shouts, repeats, and asks for freedom and democracy, he is really asking for disaster. Because there can be political systems that do not allow specific freedoms, and yet where citizens can feel free. And the reverse is also true. There are systems apparently very free, where the individual feels that he is not free. Furthermore, the liberty of a citizen is in one nation is not the same liberty of a citizen in another nation, and the liberty in one historical time is not the same liberty as perceived maybe 20 or 30 years later, or 20 or 30 years before. Tocqueville reached the following conclusions. In future, there may be or will be many republics, monarchies, and other mixed forms of government, but in essence, only three political systems can exist. One, where liberty is the most important feature, irrespective of its consequences. But if this were so, eventually there would be no political form, no state, or even politics, for complete freedom is anarchy, as we know, which anarchy is the antithesis of political structure. The second possibility is a system where equality and liberty coexist, with a tendency for equality to be perceived as more important than liberty. But this, at least says Tocqueville, after anarchy would be also the worst possible political system, from which an exit to freedom would be very, very difficult. And of this we have, if I may say so, we have recent massive historical evidence in Europe, at least during the end or at the end of the 20th century. The third possibility is a system where the political status quo is daily brought into question and citizens are continuously involved. Regrettably, both in the 19th century, as Tocqueville remarked, but also in our times, if we can say so, it is the equality above freedom political structure that the world at large is or seems to be directed towards. Equality above freedom. Most people like and want this system because it seems most attractive on the surface. Consequently, it will be implemented. We could add that the Western Zionist slogan of the New World Order admirably embodies the concept, "You will own nothing and you will be happy." But why in a democratic system equality seems more important than freedom? Because unconsciously we pretend to imitate the American pioneers on the western frontier of old. Let us imagine, says Tocqueville, that we live in a system where education, origin, speech, religion are such as not to invalidate the concept of equality. If so, we quickly reach a paradox, because all of us will be equal, but equally all of us wish to be better than our neighbor, simply because we are human. However, as the inaudible and noiseless foot of time reminds us and moves on, and under the impetus towards equality, things with an unequalizing force such as education, life experience, determination, drive, and we can add luck, tend to lose importance in the assessment of many. In the end, there is only one element that enables a citizen to demonstrate that he is better than his neighbor, meaning, in an environment where all wish simultaneously to be equal in theory but unequal in practice, this element which enables contradiction is money, more luxury items, more possibilities of ostentation, and so forth. In this context, and perhaps as an update, we can interpret the current cancel culture as the latest manifestation of the leveling principle, apart from other equally paradoxical and cataclysmic consequences expected when the movement will reach its extreme. The materialistic drive produces yet another paradox. Perceived social pressure forces the mythical average citizen to dedicate himself to the project of earning more money, to buy a bigger house, much like the pioneers or the pioneer in Tocqueville in the anecdote that I mentioned before. Hence, the conviction that with sufficient effort one can resolve any problem, even when the problem is political. This is bad. Bad, says Tocqueville, because problems dealing with freedom and politics do not have easy solution. Yet, the world ever looks for easy solutions. And this was said in 1835, 1840. The new French bourgeois king's message at the time was, become rich, get more money, get more things. Louis Philippe, that is. With the consequence that, in these conditions, politics themselves lose their original function, at least in the Athenian sense, the polis and so forth. And he who compares himself with his neighbors may perhaps feel just about equal, maybe, but when he compares himself with the rest, with the rest of the crowd, he feels very small. I am as good as my neighbor, he may say to himself, but the mass inspires fear. And in a democratic system with emphasis on the material aspect of things, the circle of reality becomes more and more restricted. For this sentiment, Tocqueville coined the term individualism in 1835, as confirmed by the Oxford Dictionary, which explains the neologism by Tocqueville as a self-centered feeling or conduct as a principle. Individualism, says Tocqueville, is the first characteristic of a bad democratic system, leading to more people living alone and or alone with their heart. Individualism, obsession for more money and for material things, was the interest of the pioneers from whom Tocqueville met in America. I help other people so that they can help me, but without any other interest. Which means that I see others not as human beings, but as a function of what they can do for me. In this sense, the other person becomes an item of exchange, an element of the market, which gives rise to another mysterious phenomenon of evolution. Tocqueville calls it the tyranny of the majority. Furthermore, in defective democracies, the individual citizen thinks that others have decided what is required to resolve the problem that he has no time to solve himself because he is too busy. This leads in turn to everybody agreeing that something is good or bad, and no one dares to oppose public opinion. Tocqueville calls this the tyranny of the majority, or, using a contemporary term, the thought unique. The thought unique may suddenly change, but it will be affirmed, this new thought unique, with a conviction equal to its yesterday's manifestation, as every viewer may have instances of. From this situation, there derives another paradox. In previous times, in previous eras before Tocqueville, tyrannies were essentially material. There was no liberty, and it was relatively easy to approach the castle or the palace of the Lord, where the revolutionaries would execute or take out the tyrannical ruler or lord, if you like, meaning that tyranny ended due to the material nature of the tyranny. But eliminating the tyranny of the majority is, as you can see, a paradox, for we are the majority, and consequently we tyrannize ourselves. Furthermore, we are convinced that we have formed our opinion independently, and therefore, at least so concludes Tocqueville, when a democratic political system drifts towards equality but not liberty, we must adapt ourselves to being the objects of our own tyranny. Eventually, in a society where there is much equality but little freedom, we may think individually that we are taking our decisions independently, but in reality we are doing the same as other millions do. This is a terrible thing and a very bad democracy, at least says Tocqueville, because it destroys the human being, and it affects both social and family relations. It establishes an economic measure throughout society and throughout all the relations among individuals, and it makes politics disappear. Politics cease to exist because no one wishes or dares to face problems that hold no solution. And problems that have no solutions but yet require it are the problems of politics, just like love, as explained in Madame de Sévigné's novels. Tocqueville was, as you can see, clearly pessimistic. He warned about the democratic political systems that established themselves in the 19th century, laden with great problems and even greater risks. They are the most difficult systems to change, he said, for they require transforming subjects into citizens, an extremely complex, if not impossible, operation. Subsequent authors who studied Tocqueville's theories observe that today, at least in televised revolutions, the masses direct themselves not towards the presidential palace, but to stores, shops, and supermarkets to break the windows and leave with as many stolen goods as possible. Why? Because politics being perfunctory, they are not felt as important. And Tocqueville almost reached the same conclusions as we know Fukuyama and his End of History. What could occur in his time, meaning the 19th century, if the political democratic systems were not sufficiently structured and managed? The citizenry at large, he says, would revert to a state of nature, of war of all against all, every man for himself, without solidarity, without help, without a social sense, friends or family. On today's stage, where all the men and women are still merely players, a citizen's life in the new world order may approach the state of nature as defined by Hobbes, featuring disorder, chaos, aggressiveness, danger, and fear. Antifa and BLM in America and the US Zionist Nazi regime in Ukraine could be examples. Tocqueville speculated, before Fukuyama, that the end of history could occur in the middle of the 19th century, because politics is dialogue, debate, discussion, compromise, conversation, and give and take. The lack of all this, Tocqueville already saw occurring during his time. Could there be, or could there have been, possibilities and means to avoid this inevitable conclusion? Actually, Tocqueville himself attempted to transform the reality of the French political world of his time by founding a movement or party. Possibly expectedly, he failed and retired to his castle in Normandy. His admirers attributed the failure to his being a political philosopher rather than a plain and only a politician. And philosophers are not known for being good politicians. Maybe this is so, but perhaps they may have found an easier explanation in the Le Misanthrope of Molière, which was written about 200 years before Tocqueville. And he said, "C'est une folie à nulle autre seconde de vouloir s'émêler, de corriger le monde." It is folly second to none to set oneself up to correct the world. Which does not mean we should not try, perhaps subject to narrowing the geography of our endeavor. It may still be difficult, but who knows? To quote an English poet of the 19th century, Robert Browning, he said, "The aim, if reached or not, makes great the life. Try to be Shakespeare, leave the rest to fate." Thank you for watching, and may all the number of the stars give light to your fair way.